I want to close with a story that I recently heard. And it's a long story, and I've shortened it. I'll give you the short version. A number of years ago in a church in London, a place called Crystal Palace in southern London, during the morning service, it was a Baptist church, a stranger stood up and he said, "Excuse me, Pastor, can I share a little testimony?" The pastor looked at his watch and said, "You got 3 minutes." Tracy laughs at that. Something that I would say, huh? Because it sounds like me. Okay, so the guy stands up and he said, "I used to live in Sydney, Australia, and I recently visited there, and I was walking down George Street in Sydney, and a strange little white-haired man stepped out of a shop doorway, put a pamphlet in my hand and said, 'Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you were to die tonight, would you go to heaven?'" And he said, nobody had ever told me that. I was astounded by those words, so I thanked him courteously, and all the way home on the airplane, it puzzled me. So he said, when I arrived home here, I called a friend, and he led me to Jesus. I'm now a Christian, and I'd like to fellowship here. Well, they were good Baptists. They stood up, applauded him, and welcomed him into the fellowship. Okay, so the pastor of that church got on an airplane. He went to Adelaide, Southern Australia, the very next week, and he was speaking in a church there. A woman came to him for counseling, and he wanted to establish where she was at in her relationship with Christ. So she explained, "Well, just a couple of months back, I was visiting friends in Sydney, doing some last-minute shopping on George Street. And a strange little white-haired elderly man stepped out of a shop doorway, offered me a little pamphlet, and said, 'Excuse me, ma'am, are you saved? If you were to die today, would you go to heaven?' So she said, those words disturbed me. When I got back here, home to Adelaide, I came to this church, and I gave my life to Christ. So I'm a Christian." Well, now this pastor is thinking, wow, 2 testimonies of one guy in the same week. So he's puzzled. He gets on an airplane, flies to Perth, Western Australia. And there, he's after his speaking engagement, he goes to lunch with the senior elder of that church. And he asks the elder, mate, in good Australian style, "How did you become a Christian?" And he explained. He said, "Well, I grew up in this church as part of the Boys Brigade, which is kind of like Boy Scouts. And he said, I went along with everything, but I never committed my life to Christ. And about 3 years ago, I flew to Sydney, and I was doing some shopping on George Street, and a little old white-haired man jumped out of a shop doorway and accosted me. He handed me some spiritual junk," he said, and put it in his hand and said, "Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you were to die tonight, would you go to heaven?" He said he was really offended, got back on an airplane, went home, talked to the pastor, and gave his life to Christ. Okay, it doesn't stop there. So now, the London preacher flew back to the UK, and he was speaking at a convention there, the Keswick Convention, huge convention. And he shared these 3 testimonies to everyone there. And after the speaking time, 3 people, elderly pastors, came up and shared they too had each met that man and gave their life to Christ because of his testimony to them. Okay, the next week, this guy flew to a missionary convention in the Caribbean, and he spoke to thousands of missionaries, and 4 people came up afterwards and said the same thing. That man handed me a pamphlet and said, "Are you saved?" Okay, then he flew to Atlanta, Georgia. He was on his way back. He stopped at a Navy, this is a true story, by the way. He stopped at a Navy chaplains convention, and the general in charge of all the chaplains, they went out to lunch together. And he shared the story of how he got saved. He said they went into Sydney Harbor on a ship for replenishing. And he was blind drunk one night, got on a wrong bus, got off at George Street, and a white-haired old man came out of a shop doorway, handed him a pamphlet. And from that day on, it changed his life. And he started training for the ministry to become a chaplain. Okay. 6 months later, he goes to India, and he's ministering to 5,000 missionaries there who are winning hundreds of thousands of people to Christ. And he goes to the home of the Indian man who's leading the entire thing. And he shares the story of how he got saved. He said he was a diplomat in service to his country. And he was living in Sydney, Australia. And one day he was shopping on George Street, and a white-haired old man came out of a shop and handed him a pamphlet. Amazing story. Okay, 8 months later, this Crystal Palace pastor is ministering in Sydney. And he asked the local pastor there, "Do you know a little old white-haired elderly man who witnesses and hands out tracts on George Street?" And he said, "I do. His name is Mr. Genor, Genor." And he said he doesn't do it anymore. He's too old and frail. But he said, "I'd like to meet him." And so they went over to his apartment and knocked on the door. And he welcomed him into his home. And the preacher from London, he told him of the accounts over the past 3 years of all the people that he met. Here's what Mr. Genor said. "My story goes like this. I worked on an Australian warship, and I lived a reprobate life. And in a time of crisis, one of my colleagues was there to help me. He led me to Jesus, and the change in my life was like night to day in 24 hours. I was so grateful to God that I promised God that I would share Jesus in a simple witness with at least 10 people a day as God gave me strength. And he said, I've done this for over 40 years. There were some days that I couldn't do it when I was ill, but I made up for it at other times. And there were hundreds of people, and I got lots of rejections. But a lot of people courteously took the tracts. Then he said this, in 40 years of doing this, I've never heard of one single person coming to Jesus until today. So one person over 40 years, sharing with 10 people a day, that's 146,000 people that he influenced for Christ. But more importantly, those that received Jesus, they took the message into the ministry of sharing that gospel. And he literally, through them, influenced hundreds of thousands of people to Christ all over the world. One person who thought that he was failing, who didn't see any fruit, made a huge difference. And you know, that man was not well known. Outside of George Street in Sydney, Australia, nobody knew of him. He wasn't on the cover of any magazine. But heaven knew Mr. Genor. Heaven knew him. Could you imagine the reception? That man died 2 weeks later after they went to visit him. And I believe that God was just giving him a glimpse of the fruit that he bore in his lifetime. And that when he entered heaven, imagine the crowds of people that would welcome him. Yeah.